Okay, so you sent over this chapter, and it's all about like the very first plants on land.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy to think about, like, for so long, the continents were just bare rock,
Right.
no life, just rocks and dirt for millions upon millions of years.
It's hard to even imagine.
I know. And then boom, all of a sudden you start seeing these really early plants popping up like around 500 million years ago.
Yeah, around 500 million years ago, that's when the real pioneering plants started taking hold.
And get this, the chapter says by like 385 million years ago, we actually had forests.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? Forests.
It's like a totally alien world compared to what we see today. And to think about that transformation happening on such a huge scale, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it, you know?
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that this wasn't just some sudden miracle. It was this gradual, step-by-step process driven by evolution, each little adaptation pushing plants further onto land.
And that's exactly what this chapter digs into.
Exactly. It lays out the evolutionary journey of how plants managed to conquer the land, how they went from water to dry land.
It's like a blueprint of that ancient transition.
It's a step-by-step guide.
So we're going to see how they're connected to algae, what adaptations they developed to survive out of water, the different groups that arose, and even how they changed the entire planet.
Yeah, and how they set the stage for all terrestrial life.
Exactly. So this deep dive is like your fast track through a super important chunk of biological history.
Without getting bogged down in the detail.
Yeah, we'll hit all the major milestones, all those aha moments, so you can really understand how plants became such a dominant force on Earth.
Because when you think about it, they're the foundation of pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem.
Totally. They provide the oxygen, we breathe the food we eat, and they shape the landscapes we see.
So to understand life on land, you got to start with plants and their journey out of the water.
So for this deep dive into your chapter, we'll first go way back to their origins, those aquatic ancestors, the algae.
Right back to the beginning.
Then we'll look at those crucial adaptations they developed to thrive on dry land.
Those evolutionary innovations that allowed them to survive outside of water.
And then we'll trace the emergence of the very first land plants.
Those nonvascular pioneers, the bryophytes.
And from there, we'll see how vascular tissue evolved,
which allowed for taller plants.
leading to those seedless vascular plants.
Like ferns and their relatives.
And eventually culminating in those mind-blowing first forests.
And all the dramatic effects they had on the planet.
It's a pretty epic story.
It really is.
So are you ready to dive in and explore this evolutionary saga?
Absolutely. Let's start right at the source with that green algae connection.
Okay, so the chapter lays it out pretty clearly. Plants evolve from green algae.
Right, and more specifically from a group called charophytes.
Charophytes.
They're the closest living relatives of land plants.
It's kind of wild to think about, right?
It is.
Like the mighty oak tree in my backyard or those delicate ferns in the forest. They share ancestry with these tiny algae in a pond.
It's all connected.
But what's the evidence for this connection? Like, how can scientists be so sure?
Well, for starters, they share a bunch of basic characteristics. Both charophytes and land plants are multicellular, at least in many of their lineages.
Okay, so not all of them, but many.
Right, and they're eukaryotic, meaning they have complex cells with a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles.
Got it, so that's a fundamental similarity.
And they're both photosynthetic autotrophs.
Meaning?
They make their own food using sunlight.
Right, like little green factories.
Exactly. And their cell walls are made of cellulose.
So those are all pretty fundamental similarities.
Yeah, but the real clincher is the more unusual shared traits.
Oh, so there's more.
Yeah, for example, they both have these circular protein complexes embedded in their plasma membranes.
Yeah, sound pretty specific.
They are. These complexes, called rosettes, are used to synthesize cellulose microfibrils in their cell walls.
So it's like they have the same unique construction method for building their cell walls.
It's a very specific structural similarity, and you don't find this rosette arrangement in other algal groups.
So it really points to a close evolutionary relationship.
Exactly. And there's more.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Well, in plants that have flagellated sperm, think like mosses and ferns,
Yeah, okay.
the structure of their sperm is super similar to the sperm of charophytes.
So again, another very specific parallel.
Right, and then there's the DNA evidence.
The ultimate proof.
Pretty much, when scientists compare the DNA sequences of plants and charophytes, they see a strong evolutionary relationship.
So they're like looking at the instruction manual of life and seeing all these shared patterns.
Exactly. In fact, recent research has pinpointed an even more specific group within the charophytes called Zygnematophyceae as our closest living algal relatives.
Zygnematophyceae.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it includes filamentous algae like Zygnema that you might see in ponds.
So that's our closest relative in the algal world.
As far as we know.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're not saying that today's pond scum literally evolved into land plants.
Right, that's a common misconception.
It's more about sharing a common ancestor way back in time.
Exactly. Think of it like cousins sharing a set of ancestral traits.
Okay, cousins, not direct descendants.
Right. And by studying these living charophytes, we can kind of get a glimpse into what those ancient ancestors might have been like.
So they're like a living window into the past.
A way to piece together the evolutionary puzzle.
Okay, so let's picture these ancient algal ancestors.
They were probably living in shallow freshwater environments.
Maybe even places that dried out from time to time.
Yeah, that would make sense as a stepping stone to life on land.
Right, because they'd be exposed to those drier conditions periodically.
Exactly. It would kind of prime them for the challenges of a terrestrial environment.
But let's be real, going from water to land is a huge leap.
It is.
Like, what were the biggest challenges these early plants had to overcome?
Well, the chapter highlights two major ones. The first is water scarcity.
Makes sense in water, they're surrounded by it, but on land, it's a precious resource.
Exactly. They had to figure out how to get it and how to keep from drying out.
And the second challenge,
Grab.
in water, they're buoyant, but on land, they need to stand upright.
Right. They need structural support to hold themselves up against that constant downward pull.
So they had to evolve some pretty clever solutions.
They did. And the chapter details a whole suite of adaptations that land plants developed.
Adaptations that their algal ancestors didn't have.
Yeah, innovations that were key to their success on land.
Okay, I'm ready for some evolutionary ingenuity. Lay it on me.
All right, so the first big adaptation is what we call alternation of generations.
Alternation of generation.
It's a mouthful, but basically it means they have two distinct multicellular stages in their life cycle.
Two different bodies.
In a way, the first is the gametophyte.
Gametophyte.
Yeah, and it's haploid, which means it has one set of chromosomes.
Okay.
And its job is to produce gametes, sperm, and eggs through mitosis.
So it's the sex cell making stage.
Exactly. Then there's the sporophyte,
Bryophyte.
which is diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes,
Okay.
and its job is to produce spores through meiosis.
So it makes these dispersal units.
Right, and these spores can then germinate and develop into new gametophytes.
So it's like a cycle gametophyte to sporophyte back to gametophyte.
And this two-phase life cycle is totally different from what most algae and other sexually reproducing organisms do.
So it's a major evolutionary shift.
A fundamental difference in how they reproduce.
Okay. I'm starting to see why this was so important for land plants.
And closely linked to this alternation of generations is the development of multicellular dependent embryos.
Multicellular dependent embryos.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's a crucial innovation.
Okay, break it down for me.
So when the sperm fertilizes the egg, you get a zygote.
Right, the first cell of a new individual.
Exactly. Now, in land plants, the zygote doesn't just float away.
Oh, so it's retained.
It is. It develops into a multicellular embryo that's protected and nourished within the tissues of the female gametophyte.
So the mother plant provides for the developing embryo.
It's like a plant version of pregnancy.
Wow, that's so different from just releasing gametes into the water like algae do.
It is a major evolutionary leap. And because of this feature, land plants are also called embryophytes.
Embryophytes meaning embryo plants.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And the chapter even mentions these specialized cells called placental transfer cells.
Placental transfer cells.
Yeah, they're found in some early land plants like Marchantia.
Dantia.
And they help transfer nutrients from the parent gametophyte to the developing embryo.
It's like a biological umbilical cord.
Exactly, a direct connection for nourishment and support.
Okay, so they've got this two-stage life cycle and dependent embryos. What other adaptations were key for life on land?
Well, another big one is the production of walled spores in these multicellular organs called sporangia.
Sporangia spore containers.
Exactly. And the walls of these spores are impregnated with this super tough polymer called sporopollenin.
Sporopollenin.
Yeah, it's incredibly durable, and it protects the spores from drying out and other harsh conditions.
This is like a protective armor for those delicate spores.
Exactly, and that protection is crucial for dispersal through the air.
Because if they dried out, they wouldn't be able to germinate and grow.
Right, they need that sporopollenin shield to survive the journey.
So it's like a tiny spaceship carrying precious cargo.
A perfect analogy. And then we have apical meristems.
Apical meristem.
These are like the growth zones of the plant. They're
Yeah.
located at the tips of the shoots and roots.
At the very ends.
And the cells in these meristems can keep dividing throughout the plant's life.
So it's like they have this constant source of new cells.
Exactly. And that allows the plant to grow in specific directions.
So they can elongate their roots to find water and nutrients.
And their shoots can grow up towards the sunlight.
It's like they have a built-in growth strategy.
It's very efficient and adaptable.
Okay, so far we've got alternation of generations, dependent embryos, walled spores, and apical meristems.
Those are some of the big ones.
And these are all adaptations that helped early plants thrive on land.
Right, but there are a few more worth mentioning.
Okay, hit me with them.
One important one is the cuticle. It's a waxy layer that covers the epidermis of many land plants.
So it's like a waterproof coating.
Exactly. It helps prevent water loss from those above-ground tissues.
But if they're all sealed up, how do they breathe?
That's where stomata come in.
Stomata, those tiny pores.
Yep, they're like little mouths on the plant surface, usually on the leaves.
And they allow for gas exchange.
Right. Carbon dioxide and oxygen out.
So they can take in CO2 for photosynthesis and release oxygen.
Exactly. And the cool thing is they can open and close.
So they can regulate gas exchange and water loss.
It's like a delicate balancing act.
So in dry conditions, they can close up to conserve water.
Right. It's a super important adaptation for surviving in those challenging environments.
And the chapter also mentions something about fungi helping out.
Oh yeah, that's a crucial part of the story too.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, early land plants didn't have true roots.
So how did they get nutrients from the soil?
They partnered up with fungi.
Fungi, those underground networks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They formed these symbiotic relationships called mycorrhiza.
Mycorrhiza.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But basically, the fungi form these extensive networks in the soil, and they help the plants absorb water and nutrients, especially phosphorus.
So it was like a team effort.
It was a mutually beneficial partnership.
The plants got nutrients, and the fungi got sugars from the plants.
It's a classic example of symbiosis.
So right from the start, plants were relying on these underground allies.
It was a crucial adaptation for surviving in those early terrestrial ecosystems.
Okay, so we've talked about all these adaptations, but when do we actually see the first land plants in the fossil record?
Well, the earliest really clear evidence we have are these fossilized spores dating back to around 470 million years ago.
Fossilized spores.
Yeah, tiny little things, but they tell a big story.
And how can scientists be sure they're plant spores?
Well, for one thing, their chemical composition matches modern plant spores.
So they're made of that same tough sporopollenin.
Exactly. And they also have these unique structural features that are only found in certain living land plants, specifically liverworts.
So it's like finding a fingerprint at a crime scene.
It links those ancient spores to a specific group of plants.
Okay, and then what?
Well, a bit later in the fossil record, around 425 million years ago, we start seeing fossils of larger, more complex plant structures.
Like what?
Things like sporangia, those spore-containing organs.
So we're starting to see the plants themselves, not just their spores.
Exactly, and that suggests they were getting bigger and more complex.
Makes sense. They're evolving and adapting to their new environment.
Right, and that brings us to a key distinction that arose among these early land plants.
What that?
The development of a vascular system.
Vascular system.
Yeah, it's the network of specialized tissues, xylem and phloem, that transport water and nutrients throughout the plant.
So it's like their internal plumbing.
Exactly, and the plants that develop the system are called vascular plants.
Makes sense. And those that didn't.
They're called nonvascular plants.
And the chapter mentions a special term for those non-vascular plants.
Yeah, we often refer to them as bryophytes.
Bryophytes.
And that includes liverworts, mosses, and hornworts.
So those are the three main groups of non-vascular plants.
Right. They're all lumped together because they lack that extensive vascular tissue.
But are they actually closely related evolutionarily?
That's a good question, and it turns out they're not as closely related as we once thought.
Oh, so bryophytes isn't a real evolutionary group.
It's more of a convenient term based on a shared characteristic.
So they're kind of like distant cousins that happen to share a similar trait.
Exactly. They each represent early diverging lineages in plant evolution.
Okay, so bryophytes is more of a functional grouping, not a strict evolutionary one.
Right, but it's still a useful term.
And what about the vascular plants?
Ah, now they do form a true evolutionary group.
So they're all descended from a common ancestor that had vascular tissue.
Exactly. And they went on to become the dominant form of plant life on Earth.
Like the vast majority of plants we see today are vascular plants.
Around 93%, which
Yeah.
is pretty amazing.
And within the vascular plants, there are some further key splits, right?
Right. The chapter would probably then talk about the lycophytes and the monilophytes.
Lycophytes and monilophytes.
Yeah, these are two early groups that both reproduce via spores.
So no seeds yet.
Nope. And because of that, they're often lumped together as seedless vascular clans.
But are they a true evolutionary group?
That's where things get a little tricky. Again, it's like the bryophytes. They share a characteristic, but they're not that closely related.
So seedless vascular plants is another one of those functional terms.
Right. It's useful for describing them, but it doesn't reflect their true evolutionary history.
And how so?
Well, for example, the monilophytes are actually more closely related to the seed plants than they are to the lycophytes.
So they're on a different branch of the evolutionary tree.
Exactly, and that's supported by shared features like their leaves.
Okay, so the monilophytes are closer to the seed plants, which of course include the gymnosperms and the angiosperms.
Right. Those are the big players in today's ecosystems.
Okay, so we've got those major groups sorted out.
The bryophytes, the lycophytes, the monilophytes, and the seed plants.
It's like a grand family tree of plant evolution.
It really is.
But for now, let's circle back to those early non-vascular plants, the bryophytes.
Okay, back to the pioneers.
What can you tell me about them? What are they like?
Well, they're generally small, herbaceous plants.
Herbaceous, meaning...
Non-woody.
So they're soft and green?
Right, and they represent some of the earliest lineages to branch off in plant evolution.
So they're like those ancient relics holding on to some of the earliest features of land plants.
Exactly, and one of their defining characteristics is that their life cycle is dominated by the gametophyte generation.
So the gametophyte is the bigger, longer-lived stage.
Right, it's the dominant part of their life cycle.
And the sporophyte.
It's much smaller and simpler.
And it's actually dependent on the gametophyte.
Right, it gets its nutrients from the gametophyte.
So it's like the gametophyte is the parent and the sporophyte is the child.
A good way to think about it.
Okay, so let's take mosses as an example.
Perfect. They're a classic bryophyte.
So that green leafy carpet that we see, that's the gametophyte?
Exactly. That's the stage that produces the sperm and eggs.
And the sporophyte?
It grows out of the gametophyte, and it's usually a little stalk with a capsule on top.
That capsule being the sporangium.
Right, where the spores are produced.
Okay, so the life cycle starts with a spore.
Right, that tiny spore lands somewhere and it germinates.
And what happens then?
It grows into this filamentous branching structure called a protonema.
Protonema.
Yeah, it's kind of like the first stage of the gametophyte.
And
then from the protonema, you get these buds forming.
And those buds develop into...
The leafy gametophytes that we're familiar with.
So that's how you get that carpet of moss.
Exactly, and those gametophytes produce the reproductive structures, the antheridia and archegonia.
Antheridia and archegonia, those are the sex organs.
Right, the antheridia produce sperm.
And the archegonia.
They produce eggs.
And for fertilization to occur, the sperm has to swim to the egg.
Right, and that's why mosses are usually found in damp environments.
Because they need water for that sperm to swim.
Exactly, it's a limitation of not having a vascular system to transport those gametes.
Okay, so the sperm reaches, the egg fertilization happens, and then what?
Then you get a zygote, which develops into an embryo.
And that embryo grows into...
Well, it's a sporophyte.
But remember, the sporophyte in bryophytes is dependent on the gametophyte.
Right, it stays attached and gets its nutrients from the gametophyte.
So it's like a little parasite.
In a way, but it's a crucial part of the life cycle.
And the sporophyte has those three main parts, right?
Yep, the seta and the capsule.
Foot seta capsule.
The foot anchors the sporophyte to the gametophyte.
And absorbs nutrients.
Right, the seta is the stalk that holds the capsule up.
In the capsule.
That's the sporangium where the spores are produced.
Okay, and once the spores are mature...
The capsule opens up and releases them into the air.
And if they land in a good spot...
They germinate and start the cycle all over again.
So it's this continuous cycle of gametophyte to sporophyte back to gametophyte.
A beautiful dance of life.
Okay, so the gametophyte is the dominant independent stage in bryophytes.
Right, it's responsible for photosynthesis and both sexual and sometimes asexual reproduction.
And the sporophyte is this short-lived dependent structure that produces spores.
A specialized organ for dispersal.
Okay, so that's the basic life cycle of a moss.
A typical bryophyte.
But what about their structure? Like, why are they always so small and low-growing?
Well, one reason is their tissues are pretty thin and delicate.
So they don't have the structural support to grow tall.
Right, and they also lack that extensive vascular system.
So they can't transport water and nutrients very efficiently over long distances.
Exactly, and that limits their size.
Although the chapter did mention that some mosses have evolved rudimentary conducting tissues.
Yeah, through convergent evolution, they evolved similar structures independently.
So it's like nature finding different solutions to the same problem.
It's a common theme in evolution.
And how do bryophytes anchor themselves if they don't have true roots?
They use rhizoids.
Rise.
Yeah, they're these root-like filaments.
But they're not true roots.
No, they're structurally different, and they mainly function for anchorage.
So they hold the plant in place, but they don't absorb as much water and nutrients as true roots.
Right, they're simpler structures.
And how do bryophytes spread to new areas if they don't have seeds?
They rely heavily on those lightweight spores for dispersal.
So they just cast their spores to the wind and hope for the best?
Pretty much. But they also have some clever ways to reproduce asexually.
Like what?
Well, some mosses produce these little clusters of cells called brood bodies.
Brood bodies.
Yeah, they can detach from the parent plant and grow into new individuals.
So it's like cloning themselves.
Exactly, a way to reproduce without the need for sperm and eggs.
Okay, so we've got the gametophite, the scorophyte, the rhizoids, and the spores.
So those are the key parts of a bryophyte.
But what about the sporophytes themselves? Are they all pretty much the same across the different groups?
Well, they share that basic structure, foot seta and capsule. There are some
Yeah.
interesting variations.
Like what?
Well, for example, moss sporophytes often have a longer seta.
That stalk that holds the capsule.
Right, and that helps lift the capsule up higher, potentially for better spore dispersal.
So it's like getting a little boost from the wind.
Exactly. And the capsule itself can also be pretty complex in mosses.
How so?
Well, they often have this ring of tooth-like structures called a peristome.
Peristome. What does that do?
It helps regulate the release of spores.
So it's like a little gatekeeper.
Right, it opens and closes in response to humidity, so the spores are released gradually.
Very clever. And what about hornwort sporophytes?
They're quite different.
How so?
They don't have a seta, and their sporangium is long and horn-shaped.
Hence the name hornwort.
Exactly. And it splits open lengthwise to release the spores.
Okay, so there's more diversity in sporophyte structure than I realized.
Yeah, even within the bryophytes, there's been some evolutionary innovation.
And the chapter also mentions that hornwort and moss sporophytes have stomata,
Right, those tiny pores for gas exchange.
but liverworts don't.
Nope. Another interesting difference between the groups.
It's amazing how much diversity there is, even among these early land plants.
It really is, and the chapter probably gives some examples of the different forms they can take.
Like in liverworts, the gatophytes can be either thalloid or leafy,
Phalloid meaning,
flat and lobed.
right, kind of like a little green pancake.
Man, leafy meaning.
They look more like tiny mosses with little leaves.
Okay, and hornworts, they're usually phalloid too, right?
Yeah, often with those distinctive horn-shaped sporophytes sticking up.
And mosses, those are the classic leafy ones.
Right, forming those dense carpets.
So they're not just a generic green blob.
Yeah.
They each have their own unique morphology.
Exactly. They've all adapted to their specific environments.
Okay, so we've talked about their structure, their life cycle, their diversity, but what about their ecological roles? Are they just minor players in the grand scheme of things?
Not at all. They actually play some important roles, especially mosses.
Okay, I'm listening.
Well, for one thing, they're really good at retaining nitrogen in the soil.
So they help prevent that vital nutrient from being lost.
Exactly, which is super important for plant growth.
And some mosses even provide a home for nitrogen-fixing bacteria.
Right, those bacteria can convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form that plants can use.
So they're like little nitrogen factories.
In a way, and that's a huge benefit to the ecosystem.
And mosses are also super tough.
They are. They can tolerate extreme conditions like desiccation and high UV radiation.
So they can survive in places where other plants would struggle.
Exactly, and that makes them important colonizers of harsh environments.
Okay, and I know we have to talk about peat moss, sphagnum.
Ah, yes, sphagnum. It's a fascinating moss.
And it's the main component of peatlands, right?
Right, those waterlogged acidic bogs,
And peat is...
partially decayed organic matter.
Okay, and why is sphagnum so special?
Well, it has these chemical properties that slow down decomposition.
So the dead moss doesn't rot away as quickly.
Exactly, and that leads to the accumulation of peat.
And peatlands are really important for storing carbon.
They're like massive carbon sinks.
And that's good for the climate.
It is. It helps regulate atmospheric CO2 levels.
But peat has also been used as a fuel source.
Yeah. Historically, it's been burned for heat and energy.
And it's still used as a soil conditioner.
Right. Gardeners love it.
And the chapter even mentions those bog mummies.
Oh, yeah. The incredibly well-preserved bodies found in peat bogs.
It's kind of creepy, but also amazing.
It is. The acidic anaerobic conditions in those bogs can preserve organic material for thousands of years.
It's like a time capsule.
A glimpse into the past.
So these humble mosses have had a big impact on human history and the environment.
They really have. And the chapter might even talk about their ancient influence on the climate.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, scientists are studying the idea that early nonvascular plants played a role in rock weathering during the Ordovician period.
Rock weathering.
Yeah, the breakdown of rocks.
Okay.
And this process consumes CO2 from the atmosphere.
So it could have contributed to a global cooling event.
That's the hypothesis, and there's some evidence to support it. Well, experiments have shown that mosses can actually accelerate the release of minerals from rocks.
So they're speeding up that weathering process.
Exactly, and that could have had a big impact on the climate millions of years ago.
It's like these tiny plants were shaping the entire planet.
It's pretty incredible, and it shows how interconnected everything is.
And of course, now we're burning those ancient plant remains in the form of fossil fuels.
Right, releasing all that stored carbon back into the atmosphere.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is from ancient climate coolers to modern climate warmers.
Okay, so we've explored the rise and significance of those non-vascular bryophytes.
Those early pioneers.
What came next? What was the next chapter in plant evolution?
Well, the next big leap was the evolution of seedless vascular plants.
Seedless vascular plants.
Yeah, they had that crucial vascular system.
Which allowed them to
grow taller and more complex.
And this was a major turning point in plant evolution.
It was, because while those bryophytes dominated the early landscape
For like 100 million years or so?
it was the vascular plants that eventually took over.
And when do we see the first evidence of these vascular plants in the fossil record?
Around 425 million years ago.
So a bit later than the bryophytes.
Yeah, but they quickly rose to prominence.
And that vascular system was the key. Right?
It was the xylem and phloem allowed for efficient transport of water, nutrients, and sugars.
So they could grow taller and support larger structures.
Exactly. They weren't limited by the slow diffusion that bryophytes rely on.
And the chapter also mentions that early vascular plants were branched and independent.
Right. Their sporophytes didn't rely on the gamedophytes for nutrition.
So they were more self-sufficient.
They were, and that branching allowed them to produce more sporangia.
More spores, more offspring.
Exactly, and that's a big advantage in terms of spreading and colonizing new areas.
But they still had that limitation of needing water for fertilization, right?
Yeah, their sperm were still flagellated.
So they were still tied to moist environments.
To some extent, but that vascular system opened up so many new possibilities.
Okay, so the chapter probably goes into more detail of the specific features of vascular plants.
It does. It talks about their life cycle, their specialized tissues, their roots and leaves.
Okay, let's break it down.
All right, so one major difference from bryophytes is that vascular plants have a sporophyte-dominant life cycle.
So the sporophyte is the bigger, longer-lived stage.
Right, it's the dominant form of the plant.
And the gamophyte,
It's tiny and often inconspicuous.
a complete reversal from the bryophytes.
Exactly, and that's because the sporophyte is so much better adapted to life on land.
With its vascular system and all.
Exactly, and the chapter probably uses ferns as a good example.
Ferns.
Yeah, those leafy plants we all know and love.
So the big fern plant that we see,
That's the sporophyte.
and the gamophyte.
It's a tiny little heart-shaped thing that grows on the ground.
So you'd hardly even notice it.
And most people wouldn't.
And it's completely independent from the sporophyte.
It produces its own sperm and eggs.
And after fertilization,
The zygote develops into a new sporophyte.
and that sporophyte grows into a big fern.
And cycle continues.
Okay, so the chapter really emphasizes the importance of that vascular tissue.
It does, because it's such a key innovation.
And it consists of two main types of tissue, right?
Xylem and phloem.
Xylem and phloem, what do?
Well, the xylem is responsible for transporting water and minerals up from the roots.
So it's like the plant's plumbing system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it